You are listening to the Primitive Intelligence Podcast, episode 512, The Saga of the German Pastor Who Rides a Donkey. You like that?
I like that a lot.
The funny thing is, that's a
lot of visuals there.
That's a true story, actually. So this week is a little bit different. This is not an unsolved mystery. This isn't about UFOs or UAPs. It's not paranormal. It's just an extraordinary story. And it's kind of a personal story to me because it's a family story. And you know some of this. You and I have talked about who we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. Well, you know me. I'm all up for a good story. And his story is pretty amazing.
And it's more amazing now that the research I did yesterday, if I look tired, it's because I was up until 3 o'clock this morning translating German text to get this story. This is the story of my great-great-grandfather, the Reverend Philip Frederick Zizelmann, who came here from Germany to be a Lutheran missionary. And the story is incredible. I stopped trying to organize my notes because I've got so much books and books and books and books and newspaper clippings and all kinds of stuff. So we're gonna talk about that. Do you have anything for this episode? Or are you just along for a ride?
I do not. I'm a passenger.
You're just along for a ride. All right, that's cool. Got a little tea today, and it's been miserable the past 2 days, so it's a good tea day. All right, so no more yapping about what the episode's going to be about. Episode 512 of the Primitive Intelligence Podcast starts
now.
There you go. It's funny. I've listened to old episodes, and when you started doing the now, it was always like now or now. In the past couple of weeks, you've just been going now.
Yeah, I honestly don't even remember. It's been so many years how he did it in the beginning.
Yeah, it was funny, but it's all good.
It was mostly, from what I remember, like you would just point at me like now. Okay.
Well,
I forget.
It's different when we're in the same room because you kind of it's easier to pick up on those cues. Like, you know what I'm about ready to say, you can jump on it. But there's just a little delay in the audio between me and you and onto the server. So a couple of the times it's been like a long pause and then now. But it's all good. So before we started, I've got all kinds of I didn't know how I was going to do this because my notes are so discombobulated. So I actually hooked up my laptop to my main monitor, which I usually have off while we're recording. So if I look really washed out for this episode, if you're watching it, that's why. I'm not ill. It's just, if I turn it off, come on. See, that looks a little better, right?
That's normal. Yeah.
It's just, this monitor is huge, and I usually turn it off because it drains this computer when we're trying to record. So let's just jump right into this. Like I said in the opening there, this is the story of Philip Frederick Zizelmann. He's my great-great-grandfather, and he came here from Germany as a Lutheran missionary. And my family never really shared the stories of our past, of our family. So all I knew as a kid was that he was from Germany, he was a preacher, and he came here to Texas first, and that's all I knew. But as I started
here to America in Texas,
to America, and he came through Texas first, and this was before Ellis Island. I mean, he was here in the 1850s, so I don't know how that worked back then. He just went, I guess. The research on this, I'm pulling from a ton of sources. I'm not going to quote each one as I go through them, but I will give a list of the resources that I'm using and not all of them have links. So in the show notes, there'll just be a list of books. And if you're interested in any of this, or maybe your family was involved in this whole region and the Lutheran ministry back in the 1800s, and you want to find some information, these are good places to start. So a few of them I have in hand that are either digital, hard copy, or a combination of the two. So the first one was the Portrait and Biographical Record of Lackawanna County, was first printed in 1897. That is one of those two books that I own that I got, I think, from Abe Books. And that's still around because I was looking at it. So I think it's an offshoot of Amazon, but it's physical copies of books, like collector's books.
Is that the one that has the atlas is that in there too? The maps of some of the I bought a okay, so there's a difference. So there's a few of that were written about the area.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. So this is, I believe, volume 2, and there are other volumes. I think the other volumes have those maps in them, because you sent me pictures of a couple of them from like the early 1800s.
Yeah, I actually years ago I stumbled upon it was from 1873, and it was a hand painted atlas map of like my neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And this is so, I mean, I can't say it's a long time ago. It's at least a decade, I think. And it was for like $20. I'm like, well, yeah, I for $20 I could get a atlas page of like my town hand painted from 1873.
Yeah.
Now, if you go out and look for it, just a page would run you like $100 bucks or something like that.
Some of the stuff is pretty expensive, but this is one of those books. I've got two of them. The one covers more of my grandmother's side of the family, not her husband's side. So those two books are both over 100 years old. They're like 120 years old, and I have digital copies of those. I try not to open them because they're just so old and so brittle. But so that's the first book. Then I've got the Images of America San Antonio Churches, which is printed in 2012, and Images of America Gillespie County 2013. And those are mostly just pictures and some short stories. Very cool books, though. If you have family or you are from Texas, those are very cool books. And then the centennial anniversary of the Zion Lutheran Church, 1852 to 1952. There's no data published on this. I think it was 1952 or 1953. And this I have in digital format only. I don't even know if it's in. I know it's not in print, but I don't know if you can find that one anymore. There's also the history of the Wilkes-Barre Conference from 1898, the Tejano Religion and Ethnicity of San Antonio, 1821 to 1860. That was published in 1995. New Homes in the New Land, German Immigration to Texas between 1847 and 1861. That was from 1970. San Antonio Was Seen Through a Magic Lantern from 1978. German Pioneers in Texas from 1925. And then the big one, the one that I was looking for years that wasn't available anywhere. I can only find snippets. And I'll attempt the German pronunciation of this, but I know I'm going to kill it, so I'll give it a shot. Kirchenreich der ersten deutschen evangelisch-lutherischen Synod in Texas. I know that's wrong. I know it's completely wrong. I'm sorry. It translates to the history of the first German evangelical Lutheran synod in Texas. This book is massive. I've seen it linked in the bibliographies of a lot of the other stuff that I've read and looked at in this time. And it is basically the official documentation from the 6 or so German missionaries who went to Texas and reported back to Germany. And a lot of this is letters written by my great-great-grandfather back to the church. And when I say letters written back, I'm not talking like, hey, it's hot here, LOL, and wait for a reply. These are chapters. These things they took forever to translate because there's so many pages. I was trying to do it page by page and then reading it and seeing where Google screwed up and then trying to fix it and finding it took forever to do this. But the information I got is awesome. And there's still more to come. Also, there's several publications from the Lackawanna Valley area. The one was the Scranton Truth was the name of the newspaper. The Scranton Republican, I believe. There was a few that I was able to pull articles from that even just mentioned them. And I've got files and files of this stuff. I've got a few of them hanging from the wall. Actually, one of them was of my great-grandfather's business that your mom found in an attic that I've got hanging on my wall.
Oh, and that piece of that advertisement or whatever.
Yeah, for the jeweler that he was a part of. He was a member of. So yes, I got some cool history on my family here. So to get into who he was, I'm going to do just a really quick. That's the wrong mouse. 2 computers, not enough sleep. A brief history of the Zizelmann name. And this is just real simple. So this goes as far back as I could find. The original, I believe, Zizelmann was Hans Zizelmann. And the only record I could find for him was his citizenship to Amberg, Germany in 1523. So I don't know how old you have to be to get a certificate of citizenship, but 1523 is a long time ago. Somewhere, and I think I lost it in a computer crash, I got information from, I think it was the city of Erbendorf in Germany from their archives, and they had him listed as a furrier and a trapper, and I believe that's what the name means, because the only link I can see to my name and any German word is a slang word used back then, and it may actually be High German of all things. The Zissel, which is a squirrel, which would be a hunter or a trapper. So my name literally means Squirrel Man, which I think is hysterical because I got a sister who's terrified of squirrels. Then we go to Erhard Zizelmann, who was a weaver, Michael Zizelmann, who most likely lived around Erbendorf, Wolfgang Zizelmann, who was the mayor of Erbendorf, Andreas Zizelmann, who was a potter, Erhard, another Erhard, who was a potter. And then my family goes into this love of just keeping the same name in the family forever. So Johann Jacob the first, he was a master potter. Johann Jacob the second was nothing listed on what he was, but we're talking like 1700s here, 1717 he was born. Johann Jacob III, who was a potter, possibly, and a wine merchant, and the member of the town court. His son, Philip Christian Zizelmann, is where things start to get really interesting, because this is Philip Frederick's father. Now, Philip Christian, now imagine being a kid in Germany and knowing that your father was a farmer. He was involved in the wine trade. I think he was a grape grower. He was also a soldier who fought at Waterloo against Napoleon. I mean, a little history in the family, which I thought was just incredible when I started reading some of the stuff. So then we get to my great-great-grandfather, Philip Frederick Zizelmann. He was born in Klebron, Württemberg, Germany in 1824. The only surviving child out of 4. He was educated in public school system until he attended the Pilgrims missionary, to the University of Basel in Switzerland, and then from there he went to the missionary St. Crotona to be ordained. And as soon as he was ordained, him and like 5 or 6 other young pastors were basically given a ticket, said, get on a boat, you're going to America. They had no idea what they were in for. They knew they were going to Texas.
And what year was this about?
This was I can tell you, not only can I tell you when it was, I can tell you what boat he was on. This was in 1853. He left from Bremen, Germany to Galveston, Texas. It took 49 days, and he was on the ship. It was a sailing ship called the Francisco. And somewhere I have a picture of that boat. I actually found a picture of it once. I don't know where it is. It was like a schooner-style ship.
I was going to say, from what I remember, you said it actually, not when you say sailing vessel, it actually had sails.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 1800s. I mean, there's no.
Yeah, it was actual wooden boat with sails from Germany to Texas.
Yeah. Now, if that much of family history wasn't enough, this guy's life from this point on was absolutely incredible. Now, I know family history can seem boring, but this story is not boring. I don't think, anyway. So 49 days, which I find, I kind of chuckled, because 49 days he was on a ship called the Francisco, and all I can think is the San Francisco 49ers.
I never did think of that.
I was like, oh, that's interesting. So he gets to Texas. When they get there, they go to Houston originally, and they form the First German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Texas in 1851, and to which I think he's the secretary. I think he's the second highest member of the synod, and the guy the Pastor Braun, who is the chief for I forget what his president or whatever, he's only 29. So these aren't.
He was an old man back then.
Well, yeah, but still, I mean, they spent their whole lives in school, in college, and being ordained. Like, and all of a sudden, you just get thrown into the Wild West. Like, this is crazy.
That's a movie I'd like to see. Right?
So they start the synod, which is like the ruling council of the area. And in Lutheran religion, there's like every region has a synod, and then there's like a countrywide synod, and then there's like the main synod of the Lutheran religion, which I believe is still in Germany. They're told by the St. Krishona that, listen, we're going to send you to America. There's some Germans there. Find them. Preach to them. That's it. Like, that's the instructions they got. So somehow they wind up going to LaGrange. It costs them $10 to go from Houston to LaGrange. They have to go with the mail. They go with the stagecoach that carries the mail, because that's the only way you can get there. All they can take are their duffel bags, their satchels, all their luggage they have to leave in Houston, all their belongings they leave in Houston, everything they brought with them. They can tie 4 horses to the coach, and they're just along for the ride. Now, this is where I start finding stuff last night, because I actually find in a letter he sent back to Germany his description of this trip. So bear with me, because I'm going to read this. It's not super long. I cut down a lot of it. It was literally a chapter, but this gives you an idea of the landscape that they were going through. In Germany, one cannot have a complete idea of such a trip with the mail in Texas. There is no road that is properly paved, and a highway is out of the question. The farmers who drive their products, cotton, etc., to the city, down the trees about the width of the road, through the forest, dragging them out of the way, while the root stumps remain. This is the route, the post road. But if you come to the prairie, the next best direction is to cross it. There is no bridge over the very numerous streams, which are mostly dry, but have deep bed, and yet the mail runs quickly over them. If these are full in winter, the horses, and if necessary, the passengers, can swim across. So basically, they're just driving through wilderness on a stagecoach. They just cut the trees off so you can see, but they're driving over these stumps and over rocks. And I mean, picture a stagecoach doing that, and you just get like, I'm sure people got thrown off them all the time. So they finally arrive in LaGrange. They're just about out of money, and they find that there's no German pastors there. They've heard of a few missionary retreats that have been set up, but there's no one there. So they start asking around. They find some people, and they're like, look, there's Germans here, but there's no one to preach to them. They get word of an opportunity in New Braunfels, and they want to go, but no, they can't find any passages there. So they're like, look, we can just walk, but someone should stay here. So they elect Reverend Zizelmann to stay in LaGrange, which he's ecstatic, because this guy, and one of the things I read, he's like, this is not, like, I'm not a walker. Like, I'm not very excited about this. So he didn't want to go anyway. So he stays in LaGrange while the other 3 head on foot to New Braunfels. So they walk, and it's like, I don't know how far it is. I think it said like 30 or 40 miles through the wilderness of a state that has just become a state.
Yeah, wilderness is the right word. It's just wilderness.
Wild, like not just wilderness,
Yeah.
but it's wild. Not just the landscape, but everything about it is wild. So he stays in LaGrange. He's got no money. He stays with a fellow Germaner named Markman, who gives him lodging. And all they've really got in LaGrange at this point are some houses that aren't really finished, and a common area that they use, all the different religions use. So he goes to this common church, and he gives his first sermon. He thinks it goes pretty well. He goes back home. This Markman walks in and says, look, you got to change the way you're doing this. The people here, you're talking about faith. Like they need morality here. They don't need faith. They need morality. This is the wild. And he's like, I don't care what you think. This is the religion. This is what we do. And this is what I'm going to preach. So he determines that it's not so much that they need a church there, but they need a school, because it's just so wild. No one's educated. They're just, all they can do is survive. So he gets a few offers. He goes to this. It's called Ross Prairie, and it's a little more civilized than LaGrange, but he meets a few people there who are from this new town of Fayetteville, and they are rich Americans. Well, rich back then. They probably have like $300, and they are very interested in retaining his services privately between like these families and the local. Like they'll pay for his lodging, they'll give him food, they'll give him a place to teach. They don't care if he teaches other people, but they'll foot the bill. So he sends a letter off to the leadership in Germany. He says, this is probably what we should be doing. He says that the Americans are more interested in our religion than the Germans. And the Germans here sadly, they're referred to as rude heathens, because they're so out of sorts. They have no religion, have nothing. Everything of them has been stripped away. So he sends us off to Germany. He stays there for a little while he waits for a reply. And they say, yeah, that sounds great, but we're not doing that. You got to go to San Antonio. At some point he does return, and he teaches there, because I did find one mention of him teaching at LaGrange. But this is pretty bad for the Lutheran church in that area, because he had no choice but to leave. The Germans and the Americans and everybody there were like, well, they just left. So they really had no faith to put back into the church. So their mission work there kind of ended. So he goes to San Antonio, and this is where I always thought the story picked up. I thought he went from Galveston to San Antonio. He gets there. He becomes the first Lutheran pastor stationed in San Antonio. And this is another one of these points where he gets there. He kind of assesses the situation, and he writes this letter, quotes, letter to Germany to tell them what he's up against. And again, this is like an entire chapter of this book is this letter. So I pulled out some of the highlights of it. And he says, with the less than tempting, rather worrying prospect of becoming a pastor in what is the most important city in the state, I boarded the stagecoach with a heavy heart. My last cent was spent on a ticket. On top of that, I had borrowed a small sum from my friend for the same purpose. Anyone who knows such lead weights attached to the wings knows how difficult flying becomes. Like, that's the way they wrote things back then. Like, I guess that's all you had to do. You just like, I'm going to write, and you just sit there and you write it out because it's written by hand.
Well, you had time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He then goes on to say, the city, as its name suggests, was built by the Spaniards from Mexico around 1680, lies in a charmingly beautiful and wide valley. On the east side flows the San Antonio River, which rises about a mile north of city limits. On the west side is bordered by the San Pedro. These two incomparably beautiful and strong river arteries unite about 5 miles below the city, from where they continue to flow as the San Antonio River to the Goliad, which is a city in Texas, and unite with the Guadalupe. The ancient city was laid out within the triangle formed by these two rivers. Since the bountiful harvest can hardly be achieved in those areas without artificial irrigation, the founders of the city set up a magnificent irrigation system, damming the length of both rivers at a distance of about 3 miles and directing the water in ditches across the entire length of the valley so that gardens and fields can be flooded about once every 14 days. So even this far back, the Spaniards and the Mexicans had come in to build, and this is like what we were talking about the past couple of weeks with these lost civilizations, that the design and the ability to irrigate and do all these kind of advanced things in this wilderness. They're able to take these two rivers, set up a city in between, a little town in between them, and irrigate so that they don't have to worry about water. So if you've ever even pictured Texas in your mind, imagine this in the 1800s, of how incredible this must be, this new land that is barely settled. He does go on to say that the separation from Mexico and Spain, and then from Texas from Mexico, and then Texas's incorporation into the United States is completely devastated the Roman Catholic infrastructure that was put in. So there's just these abandoned churches. There's he says immigrants from all sides of the windrows, especially Germans, have flowed into San Antonio, so that around the time stated above, there were about 4,000 Mexicans, 3,000 Germans, 2,000 French, just as many Americans, and around 2,000 from other nations. This is almost a Babel on a small scale. So you've got all these people in this little area because it's the only place that's irrigated. They're all speaking different languages. They all have got different religions. And they're just all crammed into this little space.
Wow, that had to be an interesting place to live. But it had to be, I'd imagine it had to be like extremely dangerous, because a lot of the people from Europe, I mean, they're literally in the country not too long. So, a lot of desperate people from a lot of different places in the world.
Yes. So danger gets brought up a lot in different ways too. They're basically all sharing these primitive churches. He's got to explain to them what adobe is, like the air dried bricks. So here's this guy, right? This young German immigrant who has spent his life in college and in missionary and gets sent to the Wild West. He's standing in this public plaza of San Antonio. The stagecoach just kind of drops him off, and he gets out and he kind of like looks at the stagecoach driver, like which way to go. And the guy's just like, yeah, takes off. And he's just standing there trying to find someone to help him. And there's this exchange that he talks about, which is just incredible. It's so funny. And this happens quite often. These stories, he just throws these little stories in. So he's looking for someone to point him some kind of direction. And he goes on to say this. He says, meanwhile, an older man approached me, whose nose and face showed that it had already cost him a lot of money. He spoke to me in the Nassau dialects. Now, the Nassau dialects, I had to look this up because he did use another word based off of Nassau to describe this guy. And basically in High German, again, a High German dialect. And I don't know how long that was spoken in Germany, but so High German, Nassau is like the best way I can describe it is a freeloader. There's a lot of ways they describe it, but basically someone who lives off of other people. He's a freeloader. So he spoke to me in the Nassau dialects. He said, "Are you a greenhorn?" I answer, "I've been in the country since November last year." He said, "You're a craftsman?" Answer, "I'm a Lutheran preacher." He says, "All you have to do is get back to where you came from quickly. We don't need any idiots here. There are already far too many here." He says, what a first greeting this was. Right? So there's this guy that he's like a freeloader, and he's calling him an idiot because he's a preacher. right? This is the Wild West. He says, but the freeloader, the Nassauer, still had a human feeling. He ran with me to several German houses to ask for food and accommodation for the night. I should give my inaugural speech tomorrow, or my inaugural sermon tomorrow. Yes, we went a step further. It took me to an inn, ordered a snack and a drink, which I, poor, hungry, and thirsty, gladly accepted. So even though this guy, it's like rough and nobody really wants to help anybody, they all kind of understand, hey, we're all in this together.
Right.
So this crazy freeloader helps him get his start in San Antonio because he's the only person that'll talk to him.
I just get this image of him leaving. What was the name of the German town?
Bremen or
Bremen, and wherever he was. And again, I'm having this romanticized version, but I just imagine him standing on like a cobblestone street with these beautiful buildings, and he's walking the one way, and then all of a sudden he's like standing like we're in your romanticized version of the Wild West, where he's standing in where tumbleweeds are going by, and there's horses, and there's like gunfights. So you go from one extreme, like literally from one extreme to the other.
Exactly.
It's an amazing story.
And remember, he went to university in Switzerland. So imagine what Switzerland was like in the 1800s. Like I've seen pictures of these towns that he was in from that time, and there's just like these massive cathedrals, and it's this beautiful landscape. And then here he is in these podunk, southwestern towns that aren't even finished yet. It's probably just mud and dirt and cactus and horse shit everywhere. And he doesn't have a penny to his name. And this is his calling.
And the church sent him there and said, "Hey,"
and not only that,
go do something.
He could have very easily got there and been like, "Yeah, I'm out. I'm just going to go find the first job I can find, and I'm not doing this." But he doubled down. He's like, "No, I'm going to make this work." So he goes on to found the St. John's Lutheran Church in San Antonio a few years later, and he was back and forth from San Antonio to Fredericksburg. Here he is. He's standing in San Antonio. He finds somewhere to stay. He's got a little food, but this is a rough life. And he's got excerpts from his personal diary in here where he's saying things like, "Oh my God, your poor man calls on you now, the merciful one, for help. You can show me, you can advise me, lead me on level paths and show me the right path. With you, I am as I am. Don't let me sink in the mud. Don't let me drown." So he's writing out these prayers because things are getting so bad. The pastors he came to Texas with are all gone their separate ways. He's got no support. He's got no infrastructure. He's got like maybe 6 families that are listening to him. That he's preaching to, which, I mean, back then families were huge, but this is like really, really a tough time to be. So he's writing down these prayers and basically saying this is just how life is in Texas at this time. But without hesitation, he just dives right into it, and he talks to every person he can, every German he can. So within like 6 to 8 months, he opens a school, a bilingual school, and bilingual German and Spanish, because Lutheran is German. He speaks German. All his sermons are in German, but Texas was a part of Mexico. So Mexican is largely spoken in the state. So that's what he's got to learn.
And and Texas was Spanish territory, right? Before.
Yeah. So it was, Texas was part of Mexico. Mexico was Spanish territory.
Okay, right. So you're going to probably have native Mexicans and also then Spanish immigrants at the same time.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. That's why at the one point we talk about it being a Babel, like because it's now a state in the Union, which was a part of Mexico, which was a part of Spain, and all these things kind of broke down in succession. It's just chaos. It is absolute chaos. So he starts doing everything he can to reach people. So his region there is like not just San Antonio, but the entire surrounding, like 100-mile radius. And at one point his horse gets stolen. So he literally is riding on a donkey around Texas or, sometimes a mule if he's lucky. And I have the plaque here. Hold on. And I'll put this in the show notes. This is from St. Paul Lutheran Church in Texas. And its plaque on the wall says, descendants of German pioneers who settled this area in the 1850s hold membership in this church. As early as 1853, missionaries such as Pastor Philip Zizelmann, who rode a donkey, held services in settlers' homes. Church was organized with 13 members on February 13th, 1872, and it goes on to talk about the church. But he's actually on this plaque as the pastor who rode a donkey.
That's pretty cool.
And I'll put these pictures in the show notes. So, yeah, so he's riding around trying to find, going to Mexican settlements, going to German settlements, going to American settlements, going to forts, going to wherever he can to preach. And this starts wearing on him. And the climate starts wearing on him. He starts getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And he winds up coming home one day, walks in the house, lays down in his bed, and he can't get up. And he's down for like 3 days. On the third day, another one of these crazy stories of his pops up. So on the third day, there's a knock at the door, and it just opens. And in walks this acquaintance of his. Let me find my spot here. Okay, so on the third day, after I laid down, and for the first time in an easy hour, the door of the room opened, and a German, unhorsed by misfortune, who had often visited me before and was only known as the crazy doctor. He never revealed his real name. He came in.
That's awesome. It's some crazy doctor shows up.
That's his name, the crazy doctor. A peculiar man, finally scientifically educated, with very chic manner. So he now came in. After looking around the room and discovering me in the corner on a bed of straw, he called out. He said, "Well, what are you doing in the nest?" I replied weakly and briefly, "Doctor, I'm sick." He said, "Why didn't you let me know?" So I replied, "I don't have anyone I could send. Also, I have absolutely no means to pay you as a doctor or a pharmacist." And the crazy doctor replies, "Well, then you'll die."
Wow.
And then he says, "But friend, I don't want that. And I don't want you to do that. You don't have to pay me. Are you happy if I treat you?" And he says, "Yes, of course." And this doctor, this crazy doctor says, "Look, I'll take care of you. I'll find out what's wrong with you. I'll pay for your medicine. If you need anything, I'll take care of you. I'll find you food." And he does. He kind of takes care of my great-great-grandfather like he says, like a mother taking care of her child. Here we go. So here's what he says. He says, "This doctor cared for me like a mother and gave me several hours a day for 6 long weeks. Finally, when I was already able to go to bed again and on the worry of distresses were attacking me," in full translation. So basically he's well enough to be worried again. He starts bringing in people from the families he's preaching to so he can teach them. And this is like a massive setback for him. He falls ill again. He's down for weeks. The doctor comes back and he's like, "You've got, what do you call it? Nervous fever." And he's treating him for that. And he starts to feel better. And the crazy doctor disappears for a while. So he's like, "Well, I can't just lay in bed." So he goes to one of his neighbors, who's a Mexican family. And he's like, "Look, I've been sick. I've been in bed." And the neighbors know, so they give him some food and they help him out a little bit. And he collapses. And the doctor shows back up and he's furious. He's like, "You're not listening to what I tell you. Your spleen is inflamed. You need to rest. Now, he's been down for months at this point. So
Yeah, I wonder what he
I have
had.
no idea. But this is a story that I can't find the book. I swear I have this book somewhere where this story is retold, but it came from this documentation. So the doctor, he goes, look, stay here. I'll be back. He comes back with two of the pastors that he came to Texas, two of the pastors that my great-great-grandfather came to Texas with. And they show up and they say, listen, the doctor came and got us. You're in a bad way. You're coming with us. We're going to leave tonight because he doesn't want you traveling in the heat of the sun, in the heat of the day. We're going to this little town, which is, I've got the name here somewhere. I think it was Castroville they go to. So they take him to this little area of Castroville. It's a farm. And the doctor tells him before he leaves, listen, there's vegetables, there's corn, there's sweet potatoes, there's cucumbers, there's water, you'll be fine there. Stay there. They know to take care of you. You'll have all the provisions you need. This is the story I read. It doesn't say it as such, but this is a story I read where he was really ill. He shows up at this farm, and the farmer's wife makes this cucumber salad that he credits.
I remember you telling me about this. Yeah.
He credits this cucumber salad as what healed him.
Wasn't it like a cucumber yogurt stuff?
Something like that. Yeah, it's like a German
like
cucumber salad. Yeah. But yeah, so he stays there for a while, and he, gets himself back to health. But yeah, it's funny that in that other story, they credit it to the cucumber salad. And I read this and there's the cucumber salad. He then winds up going back to San Antonio. He stays there briefly, and something happens. And of course, this is the official documentation, so it's just like he moved on to Fredericksburg. But in other reports, it was that he wasn't getting enough support in San Antonio from Germany. So he was like, look, if you're not going to support me here, I'm going to go somewhere where I can find support. And he went to Fredericksburg. So whichever story is correct is probably a combination of the two. He winds up going to Fredericksburg, and there he organized the Zion. He organizes the Zion Lutheran Church. He meets his wife there, Christina Schlotterbach. The Lutherans of Fredericksburg had no pastor and worshipped with other churches, and they were sick of it because Lutheranism is really strict. Like there's things that you got to follow, and these other churches, they don't. You know how different churches are. It could be similar, but there's things that are completely different. So one of the problems they had here in Fredericksburg was they had this thing. It was called the Vierdenskirchen. The best way, it's another community church, basically. So it's a building that any church can basically allot time to, so they can hold their services. So he starts using this, and he goes twice, and the people who run this church say, you're out. You're not allowed back, because his congregation just wanted to worship. So they'd go in and they'd worship, and they'd leave, and they'd come back and they'd worship, and then they left. All these other denominations that are in this church, they're kind of being riled up by, and the only way he's listed, and I don't know if this is actually his name, is Pastor Danger. I know that's just my great-great-grandfather, because you got like the crazy doctor, right. Pastor Danger, but I only ever find this guy referred to in multiple books as Pastor Danger. He's kind of stirring the pot, trying to get, that you guys should be in this church and you guys should be here, and we're going to use the church today, even though you're supposed to use it. And he's just creating all these problems. So my great-great-grandfather and his congregation, they leave, and they find a building that's not being used, and they start using that. They then start to raise some money, and they buy a lot. They buy it on a lot on a street called Sensaba Street. It's now Main Street, and they buy this lot for $45. Could you imagine?
Wow.
Buying
I wonder what that was back then, though, in the 1800s.
Those rich families were going to pay him $100 a year. So $45 is a lot.
Wow. Yeah.
The church building was roughly 50 by 40 by 20, and it cost them about $1,200 to make. They raised the money by selling corn and sweet potatoes to distant forts in coastal cities 300 miles away. The congregation volunteered their time and labor, and Reverend Zizelmann himself, he, like, when somebody wasn't there to do something, he did it, including worked in the lime kiln, stoking the fires to make the brick. They made the bricks by hand for this church. So this is that church. And I don't know if you remember, on my living room wall, I got that sketch of that little, that's the church. He literally built that by hand. Once the church was built, though, one of the first things to be done was one of his pastor friends came in and resided over his wedding ceremony. So it was one of the first things they did there was he got married.
Yeah.
So he sends a report to Germany talking about the building of the church. And he says, the building plans drawn by the pastor were accepted. One master mason and one chief carpenter were hired for supervisors. Building stones, homemade lime, sand, water, and other materials were furnished by members of the congregation. The first task was to find, acquire, and open a quarry. So they had their own quarry where the building stones could be obtained. A stove had to be built to prepare the lime. Every morning, he should have 6 men to run the kiln, and when he didn't, he would help out, and then he'd also run the kiln at night. This continued for some time, and I would mention, so he talks about a couple of people who put in like 130, 140 days of labor, volunteered it.
Wow.
Not to mention the time they spent transferring goods from place to place. They would take these, they raised the money, like I said, by selling corn and sweet potatoes over these same routes that he brought, that he came in on the stagecoach. So like up to 300 miles away, they would volunteer to take their goods, sell it, bring it back so they could build this church. The faith that was required to live in the Old West, you had to hold on to that. That's what kept people going.
Yeah, you had to just wait. You didn't have any, you didn't have an option. You had to wake up and just do what you had to do.
So that was in Fredericksburg. Shortly after he got married, they went back to San Antonio. They grew that church, but he was constantly back and forth to forts and all this. And the last crazy story I'll tell about Texas is this letter he wrote, another chapter, another book of a letter, where he's talking about he's got to go to to this fort, and the name of the fort escapes me, but he's got to go to this fort, and all he's got is a mule. So as he leaves town, the ladies, it's like a ladies auxiliary, like a ladies aid group. They make sure that any missionaries who come through have food and water. Anybody who is in need gets help. So when he goes on these excursions, they give him a bag of food. So he's on his mule, and off he goes.
On his mule with some cucumber salad and some bread.
Actually, in this case, he's got bread, he's got ham, he's got like homemade sausage, he's got some water, and he's got some coffee. Those are the provisions he takes, because he's not gone for weeks at a time. It's maybe a day or two. So he comes across this stream, and it's a good time for a break. He's hungry. He wants to let his mule rest. So, and they're using Indian paths. These are the routes they have. So he moves off the path, and he finds this little spot, and he says, like, the grass is as high as a man, and he says, but it's just peaceful. There's no one around. So he's sitting on the edge of this creek, and he's cutting up his bread and his ham and his sausage, and he looks up, and he's surrounded by a pack of dogs. And he's like, these are hunting dogs. These are Indian hunting dogs. If they're here, then there's a tribe nearby. Like they're hunting. And before he can even get that sentence out in his head, through the grass, 4 Comanches come through. And he's just like, what do I do? He has no idea what to do here. He's not on his land. He's in the wild. He's surrounded by these dogs. They get off their horses, and he realizes they're squaws. And they're looking at him. And they're touching him. And they're walking around him. And they're making funny faces. And then one starts to talk to him in broken Spanish. We want some of that ham. We're hungry. Basically is what they say.
Oh,
and
my.
He's like, I got plenty of ham. So he sits there on this embankment in Wild West, Texas, surrounded by nothing. This German immigrant with 4 Comanche squaws, and they have a meal. And then they get done, and they kind of realize, he says, they kind of realize that he's way out of Zizelmann, and they kind of just give him a look, and they kind of say their goodbyes, and they hop on their horses, and they ride away. And he's just like, gets on his mule, and he's like, I'm getting out. I'm just getting out. Like, that was way too close. And all I could picture on reading this is, can you imagine? Like, of all the hiking and backpacking I do, if I was ever sitting there for lunch and all of a sudden I was surrounded by just like wild dogs and people who lived in the forest, I would shit myself.
Right.
You know, and
well, you don't know who your friends or your enemies are. It could have been anybody showing up.
It could have been anybody.
It could have, right. And basically, anybody in that situation, you're taking your life, every I don't want to say confrontation. Every time you meet somebody, you just don't know who they are, what they want.
And
right.
The thing is he's German. Now, he's been in Texas for a few years now, but he's clearly white. And you don't know, this is around a time where relations between the Native Americans and the Americans are really falling apart. So you don't know what interactions they've had before that. You don't know. They might just see you and be like, oh, this is a white guy, kill him. He's here to take her stuff. You don't know.
Well, I wonder if it was because of the confrontations that they had with the Spanish. I wonder if it was actually better for him that he was white and maybe not, or I shouldn't say white, but maybe German other than Spanish, because maybe they took pity on him.
Maybe. I mean, I'm sure he was dressed in his clergy, garb, but whatever, call it the grace of God. I don't know, but he got out of there. Like, that could have gone all sort, like that story right there could have ended, and I wouldn't be here to tell it. That simple. Right. Like anything could have gone wrong. So he winds up leaving, getting to the fort he's trying to get to, or there's like a stop in between, and he gets some food there. He makes it to the fort he's trying to get to, and as he's going to the fort, he can hear dogs barking. He can hear hunting calls of Comanches, and he's nervous because he's like, look, that was a really good interaction I had. That could have gone bad. And Comanches, if you're on their hunting ground, they may not look to see if you're friend or foe. If they think you're trying to hunt their land, they'll just do away with you. You're already trespassing on their property, so it could have been really bad. So he gets to the fort. He talks to a soldier there. Soldier's like, oh, you're trying to go to this place. Here's some provisions. Head off in that direction. So he gets back on his mule and he starts heading off in this direction. Now it's getting It's like getting on nighttime, and he keeps hearing these hunting calls. And then he starts seeing like glints off the trail, and he's hearing voices closer, and he's like, this isn't good. This they're not hunting animals. They see me. So he basically, and I don't know if this is something that is common to do back in the day, but he basically lets go of the reins, rests them on the pommel, and lets the mule do its own thing. Because instead of him trying to figure out how to get out of the situation, he's like, the mule's going to know what to do. The mule is sensing that there's danger. He lets the mule do its own thing. The mule winds up going down to a creek, winding in and out, winds up back at the fort. He comes to the thicket, and he's back at the fort, and he's like, oh my God. He's like, great. So he goes in the fort, finds the same soldier. He's like, what are you doing here? He's like, this is what happened. He goes, oh, well, then you don't want to leave again until the morning. Okay, so he stays the night. Next morning, he gets up. He gets out to where he needs to go. He goes with a soldier, so he gets to the right spot. But on his return trip, he's coming back on his own. So he's coming down the path, and he's tired. He remembers the situation he had the night before, and he says, I need to eat, but I'm not going to stop. So he just reaches in his satchel. Again, he wraps his reins around the pommel. He's got his bread. He's got his ham. He's got sausage in one hand. He's got his knife in the other. He's just cutting off pieces, eating them as the mule's going. And he's eating, and all of a sudden, he looks up, and out of the high grass comes a troop of like a chief and a few warriors of the Comanche. And they surround him. And he's like, he's got a knife in his hand. And he's like, and he looks at them, and he knows they speak broken Spanish. So he's trying to communicate with them. And they kind of look at him, and he just kind of like nod towards his food. And he's like, plenty to go around. Whatever they made their sausage out of was just attracting his Comanches. Every time he was going by, like, what is that? It smells great. They were coming for food. So he divvies up the food, and then he stays on his mule, and he doesn't stop. He lets his mule drink, but he just goes until he gets home. And he just gets home, and he just like collapses in his bed. And he's like, crazy story. I never heard, like, of all the sources that draw from this book that talk about the experiences that they had out, they just say there was encounters, but they never go into them. And that's right there is, I almost, as you're telling the story, I think that maybe they knew. I mean, if they had hunting dogs, those dogs were probably smelling that donkey and him and that food. So they probably knew they probably were following him and watching him, and they knew he wasn't really that much of a threat. And they probably they probably just went up and had a conversation to see if he was going to be nice. Like, oh yeah, here. Yeah. And they kind of knew too, like, it's not really robbery, but hey, listen, there's like 6 of us, right, and there's one of you with a pocket knife and a mule. So how about you share some of that food? Yeah. And which he was more than happy to do. So he goes back, he's in Fredericksburg, and the last letter he sends, the least that I have here, he's talking about San Antonio and the way that they worship there. And he says, the type of Catholicism is French, with the clergy themselves a sign from France. On Sundays, one can hear the church's music of such noise with the banging of drums and the accompaniment of tambourines. Of the Protestants, little good may be said. For the most part, their preaching pays off only in the secular world. And this is where he kind of complains about this guy Danger. And he writes this article, and there's like a publication that goes around the area, and he, all the pastors write for it, and he writes this article. He writes this little passage about this pastor danger, and he's like, look, this guy is literally stirring the pot. He's creating all these problems, and the people there read it, and they start leaving this pastor danger and go into either him or to other congregations.
Right.
But he winds up writing to Texas, and he says, look, my life's in danger here. Like, we need more support here. And he's there for a little while longer, and then they wind up pulling him out of Texas. He's done his work in Texas, and they send him word to say, you're going to get on a boat and you're going to New York City. So he's like, well, it's got to be better than Texas. Right? At least this.
Well, everything. Yeah. How many times did you almost die?
It's not that cities are a lot better, but it's a city. You're not in the wilderness. So he gets on this boat. He goes to New York, and almost immediately upon getting there, he meets with an old friend who says, "Listen, until they give you an assignment, why don't you come with me? We'll go to upstate New York, and maybe you can stay here. Maybe this will be where they'll assign you. Maybe if they see that you're here, they'll assign you here." So he goes there briefly, and almost immediately they say, "New directions. You're going to Scranton." And I looked up this town, and I forget what the name of it was. That was in upstate New York. I wish he would have stayed there, because maybe my family would still be there. It's right in between the Catskills and the Adirondacks. Like right in between.
Really?
Yeah. It must have been gorgeous there in the 1800s. I can only imagine.
How could you imagine? Yeah.
Yeah. So
nothing but trains and farms.
if there was even trains, I mean,
if there was even trains,
we're talking like center state between, not in the Hudson.
Oh,
like
I see what you're saying.
In between,
okay, yeah.
like where the two parks almost kind of like they get close to, they don't really touch, but they kind of get close to each other, like in that region. So he was there for a brief time, and then they sent him to Scranton, and he gets to Scranton, and there's a congregation, but they're not well organized. So he comes in, and now he's like, look, I just survived Texas. This is going to be easy. So basically it is for him. He gets to Scranton, and he becomes one of the most respected clergymen in the area very quickly. And he winds up, there's a public, what do we call this? It's almost like a Grange Hall, or like a meeting hall. We don't have them anymore, but they used to have them in cities where like a community center kind of thing. But they would use that for services, or they would go to a house here or there, and I've looked at where his house was that he built, and it was at the end of Mulberry Street. Well, at the time, the end of Mulberry Street, which was the edge of Scranton, which is now where Harrison Ave is. So there's a lot there where there's always like a RV or a boat or something parked there. Every time I drive by it, I'm like, that's where the house used to be. That's where he used to live. So he lived on the outside of the city. He wound up buying a church and a parsonage from a Welsh congregation down in Mifflin Ave, down by the river. They used that for years. They built it up, and then like he didn't have enough excitement in his life. He decides, well, I'm going to start going up to this. What's the area called now? Petersburg.
Corners.
So the area in Scranton called Petersburg Corners at the time was not. It was its own settlement. It was not a part of Scranton. Scranton was considered far away. So he had to. Now
it's just a neighborhood. Like you wouldn't think it was.
All the roads connected.
But
so he goes up there, and he's like, "You guys need a church."
Which is closer to his house, believe it or not.
Well, now
that would have been relatively close.
Now it is, but it was through the wilderness at that point. There was literally nothing between. It was it's like maybe a mile,
right?
If that, up to Petersburg Corners.
through a forest,
through a rugged Pennsylvania forest.
Right.
So he'd walk up there. So he'd walk to his church down on Mifflin Ave, which is probably a mile from where he lived, down the hill. And then he'd walk up to Petersburg, and he built a church up there. And the congregation was like, well, we want a resident pastor. We don't really want, you're here sometimes, but we want a resident pastor. So he's like, oh, okay. Look, I got my own church. If that's what you guys want to do. The church is yours. No hard feelings. I'm going to go do my thing. So he goes.
Right.
And this is the St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church. The lot was on Ash and Prescott. It's now a bank. He officiated the laying of the cornerstone in 1868, and he served until 1870. And that's when some of the congregation was like, we want a pastor that lives here. So he leaves. This caused a huge problem in this church because they now had to pay someone to live in the church.
Right.
And so all these other members of the church who were like, why, what was wrong with having him here? Like, there was no problem. It was like a political struggle within that church. So after 7 pastors in 8 years, and like all kinds of, like someone lasted like weeks and they're like ousted, they reelected him to be the pastor in 1878. And then he preached there until 1882. And he was like, this is too far for me to walk. I can't keep doing this.
So that was still in the old location where that bank is.
There is a church now down like 2 blocks down. That is the continuation of that church, but the original church is gone, as is the one over on Mifflin Ave. But the one on Mifflin Ave, I do have pictures of, and I've got that hanging up on my wall, and I'll put a copy of that in the show notes too. So he's now just with the Zion, the Zion Evangelical Church on Mifflin Ave. There he stays until he retires. But as I go through the newspapers, and I'm not going to go through all the articles, but all these articles and some books, there's a lot of books I didn't mention because there was just a mention of them. Like these socialites and these influential people from the area who knew him, who had him come in for a wedding or a funeral or some kind of ceremony. And his name pops up for this guy who wanted no fame. He went no recognition. His name pops up everywhere in all these books. But then the city starts recognizing him. And there's several articles about, like, he's the longest tenured clergyman in the state. And they give him all these honors. And they write up these articles about him. And it's like a year before he retires. And they give him this big write-up, and they have this ceremony for him, this dinner, and I can't find anything about this dinner or ceremony, but he's like, you know what? I've got people that can do this for me now. He was, how old was he when he died? So he's in his 70s now. He died when he was 78. So at this point, he's like 76. He's had a hard life. He almost died from illness a few times. He almost, he almost got eaten by wild dogs. He had this 49-day boat trip from Germany to Texas. He went from Texas to New York. He's walked all over everywhere. So he finally retires. And then in 1902, he passes away. Articles. I got so many articles here. So as I'm going through these, there it is. Some of the articles that were written about him. Yeah, so this is as he's getting ready to retire. It says here's a veteran, and then he's named his successor. So he's getting ready to step down. Half a century in the ministry. Article about him in Scranton. Got this crazy sketch of him.
Well, that's a sketch. Don't you have a picture of him on the wall, or is that
I believe is a photo. I believe that was a photo that was taken, or it's a very well done sketch. The sketches they use in the newspapers are based off of that, but you can definitely tell that they're hand drawn. Okay. drawn. So there was another article where they were talking about veterans of the pulpit. So he was written about a lot in the area, and his family, his immediate family, his sons and his daughters were successful in the area in their own right. But when he passed away, he got about like a half page. Well, no, maybe not a half page. He got almost 2 full columns on the paper. And I had this hanging in my kitchen right now. I actually I went online. There's, what's the name of the site? Newspapers.org, I think. Newspapers.com.
I think I've been there. Yep.
So you can go through, it's like almost like microfiche of newspapers, but you can buy, and I think it was pretty cheap. It was like a subscription and you get the downloads. You can buy full pages of the newspaper. So
nice.
I bought the full page of the newspaper, and it's huge. And I had it printed up on like a nice piece of photo paper, and then I framed it, and I've got that hanging on my wall. And it just says, the end of a long career, death came while asleep. Reverend P.F. Zizelmann, oldest minister in this county, passes peacefully away. And it just goes through a listing of what he did in his life. And it's just this, for a city to take that much effort to put this, an obituary is one thing, but to have an actual proper article written about you just kind of speaks to the accomplishments that you made in your life. And he was never rich. He never sought fame. He never, like, he could have wrote a book about his life and could have sold.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like that was what he was interested in.
Yeah, not at all.
He just wanted to
preach. He had that faith and he believed in it. And anywhere that I saw that he ever preached, and I've looked at like churches that he was a part of or that he even was associated with. Like there's one story I read where he was going to visit Germany. This is in the 50s, back when he was in Texas. He was on his way to visit Germany. Another German church, I don't think it was even Lutheran. They knew he was going, and they approached him. They said, "Hey, listen, we've got some money. We want to buy an organ from this company in Stuttgart." And he said, well, "Okay, what do you want? I'll buy it for you, and I'll bring it back with me." So while he was in Germany, he bought this organ, and he brought it back, and he took it to them. And it just says that the pastor ordained it or like blessed it. I don't know if they meant him or the pastor of the church, but yeah, like there's no like, I'm not doing that. He's like, "Oh yeah, like who travels with an organ?
Yeah, I'm gonna be there. I'll just bring it back.
Buy an organ, no problem." I mean, they paid for it, but yeah, he arranged to have it brought over with him. And there's all these stories in all these churches. When he left, they were like, "This is a loss." Like, if he wasn't happy, the community wasn't happy, and when the community wasn't happy, he wasn't happy. And it was, I never knew the man. I never met him. I never met my grandfather, for that matter. But as I read about this guy, and there's no crazy ending, there's no fantastical ending to this. He lived his life the way he wanted to live it. He passed away in his sleep, and the people that he interacted with missed him and found him important. And when you look at how life is today, there's very little of that. And people we look at anything, any kind of inconvenience, like your keyboard's not typing the words you want it to type on your phone. You're like, "Oh, this can't believe how crappy life is." Think about this guy in his 20s, a German guy who barely speaks Spanish or English, and he's basically lost in the Wild West and sent to people who don't necessarily want him to be there. Like a lot of them didn't ask for a preacher. They didn't ask for a missionary. They were too busy trying to survive. And he went there, and there are several articles that name him instrumental in the fact that there's even Lutheran churches, not just in Texas, but in the country.
Oh, that's
And
great.
it's like, I'm not a religious person, but I see the importance in his faith. And at the time that he was alive, that was the most important thing, because without that, how do you survive?
Well, and I'd say that when you have a positive impact on other people, it and I don't want to use the word, I don't want to refer to it as karma, but it does get paid forward. So if when you're good to somebody else, generally they'll be kind and good to somebody else. And there was 100 something years ago, it was more selfless. So you just did it. That's who you were as a person. And we need more of that today.
I mean, you didn't have a choice. People understood at the time that we're all in this together, especially like out there. Like, I guess in the East Coast at that time, maybe it was more, people were a little more likely to want to be on their own. But in the West, the United States had just formed. We were still going through some tumultuous times. And if you were out there, if you were on the frontier, it didn't matter if you wanted that person there or not, if you knew who they were, if you trusted them, or if you liked them. You had to hope that they weren't going to steal from you, kill you, or worse. And I think it instilled trust in people, or maybe just an ability to be trustworthy. Like, you knew that you can't screw that person over because you don't want them to screw you over. So you have to be more trustworthy. Right. And I think in a society like we have today, that's not as important, because we're so connected. You can lop off whole arms of people that and just go a different direction. Because with social media and all that, you can just kind of make your own way up. But back then, you didn't have that connection. If you, like I said, when he was contacting Germany, it wasn't like he was on the phone. It wasn't even like today, where it might take a couple days to get the letter. If it takes 49 days to sail there yourself, it's going to take 49 days for the mail to get there, and then 49 days for it to get to you or back to the country, and then they got to find you.
Right. Well, and then they're gonna actually have to read it and respond, which it's not going to happen in the same amount of time that it will today.
Because they thought things out. I mean, when I tell you, his letters were like chapters, 7-8 pages of double column, like calligraphy style written pages
right.
of letter. And like, this writing a letter it wasn't like today. You just send a text and you're like, oh, like, what I sent you before, oh, I'm gonna eat something and I'll be ready to record and send it. No, you like, it'd be, I hope today finds you well. And, the weather here has been, and you tell everything, because you got to, because it's going to be a while before you get a reply. And then by the time you get,
and it might be the last time you heard.
It might be the last time you can send something, because by the time 80 days goes by or 100 days goes by in between letters, minimum, a lot can happen in 100 days.
Well, just imagine that group of people he arrived with, and they decided to go their own way. It's like, well, see ya. Yeah. Because it's not like you're ever going to find them again unless you happen to show up to that town and go looking for them, and maybe they're still there.
I mean, there's in closer situations like that, you had a little bit better communication, but not great. And like this, the information I just shared is only his point of view. There's still like letters and points of view from these other 4 guys, or these other 3 guys. Like this book it's incredible. And there is now an English translated version of it. And I almost want to buy it, but it's like, I can translate this one. And I think it might be, I don't know what's going to be more accurate. Right. But I mean, it's an incredible story of what you had to do to survive when a country was new. And when you think about anything that could be wrong in your life today, just Picture yourself eating some sausage and ham in the wilderness, and you're suddenly surrounded by a pack of wild dogs, hunting dogs, and 4 Comanche squaws with their, and I did forget to mention, with their bows and arrows. And they got you surrounded, and you don't know what they're saying. That's a stressful day right there.
Yeah. That's enough for, I think, for a lot of people to just pack up and go somewhere else and say, okay, this is not the life I'm looking for. Although, I mean, what would he have done if he wanted to?
I mean, you just disappear. But he didn't. That's the fact. I mean, he didn't particularly like the traveling aspect of it. He didn't like the riding a mule around the wilderness aspect of it. He didn't like the climate. He didn't like the confrontations he was having. He didn't like, the pastor danger. He didn't like the boat ride. He didn't like what he was being paid. He didn't like any of it. But he was dedicated to his faith, and he kept doing it. And that's like, people don't have that today.
No. Well, I mean, and most of just even to get to the human connection today, is there even, everybody's too connected to a point where what would you even have to say? What would most people say about someone? Oh yeah, he was a good guy. But would you have that much of an impact? Except for the people you're close to. But for the most part, people are so connected that they think they know someone and they really have no connection whatsoever.
No, you're so connected, you're disconnected.
Right. Where he went out of his way, as a lot of people did back then, went out of their way to actually be a part of people's lives and to try to make things better.
Yeah. And you just don't get that. I mean, you do. I'm sure there are people that do that, but there's a lot less people doing that now than there were back then. Scale, back then more people I think were trying to do it. There's less people, but there was more percentage of that. Higher percentage of people are trying to make things better, and I'm sure a lot of people are trying to make things worse too, trying to make it better for themselves. But and there's still more of this story that I don't know. I've reached out to 2 of the other churches that I found out that he was instrumental in the founding of. The one got back, 3 other churches. One of them got back to me, and they're pulling their information, and they're going to try to get it to me tomorrow. The other 2 I haven't heard back from yet. And then I found the United States wide synod of the Lutheran Church, and I reached out to them and see if they have any information or if they know somebody who can get me more information on them, because I'm sure there's going to be more. It's just
it sounds like there'll be more stories.
And this is just one person in my family, and I read these things and then I sit there and I go, "What the hell have I done?" So I hike on pre-marked hiking trails. Good for you. This guy was forging his way through, the wilderness of Texas with nothing.
But I would have really liked his perspective to think about, you're born, raised in Germany, you go to school in Switzerland, and then all of a sudden the church says, hey, guess what? You're going to America. You probably don't have a choice, and you're like, well, it's in God's hands.
Well, a lot of times that's what he says too. He's like, it's just, if it's the Lord's will, that's what's going to happen.
Right.
But I would be fascinated. Like, if there was, people are like, if there's anybody from history you could ever talk to, it would be him. I would love to sit down and just have a conversation with him, and he would probably hate my guts. He'd be like, what a heathen this guy is. But it'd be incredible to speak to that man and get the stories from, because these are stories that he sent. This is the stuff he was sending to his bosses, pretty much. Imagine the stuff that's not in there. Right. So if I could find, he had a diary. I don't know what happened to that. I have no idea what happened to that, and I wish I could find it.
See, that would be interesting because I would like to hear his firsthand interactions with the people from around here 100 years ago or 100 plus now at this point. That would have been really interesting to see his insight of a boom town, if you will. That would have been.
You know, it'd be funny if it turned out that he was the first one to say "Ana." That's a local joke. Local joke there.
That's a local joke.
But that is the story of, at least for now, of the Reverend Philip Frederick Zizelmann, my great great grandfather. I mean, I hope it didn't bore you guys. I find it fascinating. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just me.
I think it's an awesome story, and it's a true American story. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, it is. And I know there's a lot of times people say, because I have a pretty not stringent view, but I really believe that as a country we should protect our borders, right? But a lot of people go, "Oh, well, you're anti-immigrant." No, I'm not. I welcome anyone who wants to come to the United States and do it the right way. I mean, do we need to change the way that is? Maybe. Do we need to make it easier in some ways? Or we're using an antiquated system? Possibly. But there's ways to do things and there's ways to not. But yeah, I mean, that's the perfect immigration story of someone who came to the country and had to basically make the country. I mean, he, in the one article, they say he's like one of the original people in Scranton, which I don't know how true that is, but I know he was one of the longest serving pastors, clergymen in the state, in the city, definitely, but in the state, in the region. But I don't remember when Scranton became Scranton, because before that it was Slocum Hollow. I
can't remember right now. Yeah, I can't remember right now, but it would have been a wilderness for the most part. Yeah. Well, I mean, by 1902, the coal would have been big by then. So there would have been, it was, I know at one point it was busier in comparison to like New York City. Yeah. There was that many people.
Yeah, per capita there was more people in Scranton than New York City at one point. Right. Yeah, it was a huge city. Now we're talking 1860 he came to Scranton. Right. So it was Scranton for a while before then, I know that. But it was not huge at the time. I mean, if the city limits were Harrison Ave, well, Harrison Ave wasn't even there. That was the wilderness. If you're standing on Harrison Ave now, you were in the woods in 1860. You were out of city limits. So, I mean, Scranton's a lot bigger than that now.
Right. Well, there might have been iron furnaces. There might have been coal mines.
Yeah.
So there might have been a railroad.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's railroad.
I mean, there's a lot of railroads came through. So.
Well,
But when you think about how big it is, the neighboring neighborhoods, if you will. I mean, you're talking the city probably was huge, and then you had a lot of settlements. In comparison, would have been not even just the country. It would have been it would have been like a day's ride on a horse.
Well, I mean, think about it. When you think of the area, if you're from Northeast PA and you know Scranton at all, you've got like Petersburg. It's now known as Petersburg Corners. That was its own town. You've got Providence. That was its own town. You've got what's the other little one down that way? Like down by where the racetrack used to be. The plots.
Oh, the flats. The plot.
Yeah, that was its own little town. Yeah. It's amazing that like Dixon City isn't a part of Scranton. It's amazing that Dunmore didn't become a part of Scranton because it expanded. All those little towns that were their own settlements and their own towns all wound up getting enveloped by the city of Scranton, and a few of them survived, and they're their own things now. But we're talking way before that, and it must have been an incredible time to be here.
Oh, I would have been fascinated.
Or it sucked. One or the two.
Well, I think that depends on your spot in life. I mean, I had an ancestor who was a coal miner, and around the Molly McGuire days, and I would think, man, that had to be a hard life. And from what the family used to tell me, because they're mostly gone at this point, but during those times, he made a lot of money as a coal miner. And when he was done coal mining, he bought land and became a farmer. But it wasn't, I mean, he was a coal miner, but it was enough for him to better himself and his family. So it's interesting.
Yeah. And
it all depends on where you are in life. Like something,
and I've got a lot of stories from the area because, I mean, that's just one person in my family. There's other people on the Zizelmann side. There's people on the Battenberg side. My family stories in this area are incredibly diverse, from rags to riches to murders, you name it. It happened in my family and in this area. And that's why I'm like, it could have been great or it could have sucked. Because Suntag, Sunday, he on the Battenberg side, he owned an inn, and he opened the door. He was locking the door up one night, and somebody knocked on the door. He opened up, and he got stabbed, and that was it. He got murdered right in his own establishment. So it's luck of the draw sometimes. You never know.
Yeah.
So
same thing as today.
Yeah. True. But you just kind of are. You're always kind of in danger mode, I think, nowadays, because you never know what's going to happen. I guess back then you were too, because literally you could just get shot and nobody would know where it came from. Because there's no rifling, there's no nothing like that. There's no registration of guns. There's no, like, I'm pretty sure the guy that they arrested for stabbing Sontag, I'm pretty sure that they knew he did it, because they caught him days later with the knife still in his possession. Really? I think the cops are just like, you're guilty. Here's a knife. That's what it seems like.
I'm sure a lot of that went on.
I think they caught his partner. Maybe his partner did it, and he's like, no, it was him. And they were like, okay. And they got that guy, and they like, look, he's got a knife. It must be him. Because he was Hungarian, and they didn't like Hungarians back then, so they threw him in jail. Who knows? I don't know about that one.
Yeah.
But this has been a long episode, and I've got a lot of editing to do on it. So I want to thank everybody for listening. I hope this didn't bore you too much. It was a lot of information. It was a little bit dry, different than what we have been doing, but that's kind of the point of the season. Fair game. So if you want to find us on Spotify, and Spotify's kind of weird to search sometimes, I notice. I've had a hard time actually pulling up our feed on Spotify. I set up the URL show.primitiveintelligence.com. If you type that in, it'll take you right to our Spotify page. So that'll make it a little bit easier. Or you can just go to primitiveintelligence.com. We got our links there. And you can contact us at podcast@primitiveintelligence.com. So if there's something you want to talk about or a comment you want to make on one of our episodes, you want to reach out to us, you can go ahead and do that. Other than that, I've got nothing else. You got anything, Rocco?
I've got nothing else. No, I have nothing. This was a wonderful story.
Well, thank you.
So,
thank you. And that's going to do it for us. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the rest of your week. See ya.